Alright, Knowledgia. Let's see how well you handle my somewhat topic. The Vikings are adjacent to what I study. Viking Age, medieval, that's kind of what I cover. Specifically, Alfred the Great. Now, of course, that does not cover the entire Viking Age. That covers really the latter end of it, I would say. Closing in on towards the end, I'd say the Viking Age maybe lasted, after Alfred's death, maybe max 50 more years. I don't think they made it past the year 1000. I think it was mid to late 900s when they were pretty much gone. Honestly, you could even make the argument that they were gone by the early 900s. Because their main area of focus was England, and then once Alfred and then Edward secured more of the borders, Vikings weren't really flourishing as they were before because Europe was learning, and they couldn't do raids as they once could. Now, of course, I wouldn't say they necessarily truly stopped. However, the concept of going on a raid, would pretty much end with the conversion to Christianity and further consolidation of power in Scandinavia. Really kind of ends it. Well, also, though, the consolidation of power also helped spur the Viking. It's weird. But also, then you have the Vikings that went to Normandy. Then there were the Normans in Sicily. No, not Sicily. Sicily. Naples area of Italy. They mainly stopped raiding, and it just fizzled out. The cost of going on a Viking compared to the potential profits was pretty much gone. So, but I'm curious what Knowledgia is gonna say. I trust you, Knowledgia. Disappoint me.
The Vikings, a people that have captivated the modern world and sparked great admiration of their kind.
Yeah.
But who really were the Vikings, and how did their society collapse? The word Viking is defined by Merriam-Webster as one of the pirate Norsemen plundering the coasts of Europe in the 8th to 10th centuries.
Correct.
In the mind of modern man, however, Viking seems to simply denote someone of historic Scandinavian ancestry. The problem with this contemporary description, though, is that many of the people within the old Scandinavian societies were not really Vikings. It was only those who went out on raids, on a hunt for riches. So Scandinavian does not actually equate to Viking, and every Viking was not Scandinavian. Furthermore, the Merriam-Webster definition
Yeah, I'll give it to him. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you would have outsiders becoming Viking, but when we look back to that definition of what we consider a Viking, we are talking about Norsemen, who were pirates that went plundering from the 8th to 10th century, which then by that definition, I guess you could say that means all Vikings were Scandinavian because of, the whole Norse. Well, the Norsemen, calling it Norse is actually wrong, because the Danes were Viking, but they weren't Norse. There's a difference between Danes and the Norse. The Norse are, from what I remember from my studies, and from what it seemed like, because historians did put a difference on them. It seems, when I was doing my research for my thesis, is that there was a difference between Norse and Dane. Norse referring to, Swedes and the Norwegians. Mainly the Norwegians, but I think they lumped Swedes into the Norse as well. And then the Danes were separate. The Danes were referred to as Danes, and then the others were referred to as the Norse. So that Merriam-Webster definition is kind of wrong. Take that, Merriam-Webster. Get owned.
also seems flawed, as, in actuality, the Viking Age did not end until the 11th century, though, to be fair, It was at the very start of this century. So who were
Yeah.
the Vikings, and what did they do? Records of these people today remain limited, given that
Alright, so my face is covering it, but I'll read it. Early modern publications about the Vikings appeared in the 16th century. Historia de Gentibus Septa, fuck that, History of the Northern People of Olaus Magnus, and Gesta Danorum, Deeds of the Danes, by Saxo Grammaticus in 1514. Several writings have appeared since the 17th century with Latin translation. A lot of our sources on the Vikings are from Christian perspectives, if you are wanting primary sources. You are not really... Primary sources that come from the Vikings themselves are just going to be pretty much materials. Swords, shields, armor, ships, that kind of stuff. Maybe some runes, but not much writing of them.
most accounts we have of the Vikings came either from their victims, who would, of course, have some bias in their recounting, or from Scandinavian sources that were not written until centuries after the actual Viking Age.
And to note, what is also important about those sources that are written several centuries after the Viking is that they were written by Christian Norse now. The Norsemen, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes, whoever, who are writing these books on the Vikings these centuries later are Christian now. Their paganism, or the old Norse religion, is gone.
From what we know, the majority of the pirates we refer to today as Vikings came from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, with some others hailing from Finland and Estonia. These people were Norse, and differed from the growing number of Christians that surrounded.
As I said, I don't find a problem with referring to the Danes also as Norse, since they are very much similar in culture to the Norwegian Swedes. However, as I said before, I think technically it seems that Danes are referred to as separate from the Norse. And yeah, I don't know if that's just a preferential, because when the Great Heathen Army came, that army was led by Danes, and so they were, I think it was also an army pretty much comprised of Danes, not led by Norse. So I think there is a distinction there. There is a difference, a slight difference. What that difference is, and why we refer to the Danes as Danes and then Swedes and Norwegians as Norse, I don't know. It's just a thing that I saw when I was doing my research when I was writing my thesis.
Surrounded them. They were generally viewed by the societies they invaded as uncivilized foreigners. The goal of the Vikings, as most historians have found, was riches.
Popular culture, Viking warriors are associated with horned helmets, but there's no evidence that Viking helmets had horns. No, because that's too easy to grab and take off. Yes, they wanted riches. Yeah.
Their methods, however, were what often deemed them to be greatly uncivilized and dangerous. Although they were not necessarily war-loving or blood-lusting people, they still wasted no time in massacring those who resided in the places they plundered. Additionally, since the Vikings were not driven by religion and simply wanted to raid targets that would prove easy to access and would provide a plethora of booty, one of their frequent destinations for forays became monasteries, which further pushed the narrative for the horrified Christian Europeans that these people were barbarous savages. One raid in particular, often recognized as the commencement of the Viking Age, was then unsurprisingly carried out on a monastery. On June 8th, 793, off the coast of Northumberland, the Lindisfarne Monastery was stormed by a group of Scandinavian pirates. These Vikings were not intending to destroy the building, but they did still cause damage throughout their looting of the monastery's relics and valuable possessions. And even worse, sending a shockwave through the unsuspecting European world, they massacred every monk who stood in their way and sold the survivors into slavery. This was only the start.
To note, I also want to add, slavery was also common practice in England at this time. Not the slavery that, you know, most people think of today, where it's specifically a group of, that's American slavery. That's Atlantic trade slavery. This slavery is pretty much prisoners of war, captured, you know, those kind of people. There isn't a good definition on it. I haven't found. it was just briefly mentioned when I was doing my research, so I don't know too much about slavery at this time period. I just know that there was a sizable slave population, so it's not like the Vikings were the only ones that took slaves in combat and then sold them or whatever. No, Europe did, pretty much all of Europe did that.
Of the new reign of terror that many Europeans would face under the Viking dominance, but things were still not as simple as they may seem. The Vikings were different than other invaders in multiple regards, with one being the fact that they had absolutely no goals of building an empire or establishing colonies. Remember, these were pirates,
Not until that would change, though, in 865 when the Great Heathen Army landed on the shores of East Anglia. Why this change happened, I don't think it does not seem to be known or at least understood why they decided to shift from purely raiding to becoming now conquerors. Sadly, that's the best I can give you. I wish I could give an answer why that shift happened, but I was not able to find one in the books that I read.
a nation or even an ethnic group. What made a Viking just that was his career of raiding and plundering. So, although the Vikings began voyages to invade and steal from territories throughout Europe and even North America on a regular basis, they had no plans of maintaining any of these lands for themselves. The absolute main focus of the Vikings was always money, and they just didn't view colonization as a very lucrative route. Instead, these Scandinavian pirates used a combined method of raiding, trading, and slave selling to build up their income and worth. To really grasp the extent to which the Vikings would go to gain their riches, it may be important to remember that they, at one point, even attempted to sack the holy city of Constantinople itself in 860. The Byzantines were ultimately the more powerful opponent, and were able to protect their land and possessions, but the Viking enthusiasm is still evident.
And then they would have the Varangian Guard, made up of
Furthermore,
Norsemen.
the Byzantines were actually impressed with these foreign invaders, and some Vikings
Knowledgia and I are in the same wavelength here. We think the same.
were even hired to join the Emperor's personal guard after the raid ceased. They were able to set up a few trading towns throughout the region, so the Vikings...
Yes, I like how there's an emphasis on the trading of the Vikings. That is pretty much precisely what they were. They would, of course, raid easy targets. They did not want to get stuck in pitched battles. Because also battles at this time, at least, like, Vikings were not great warriors. I wouldn't say they were bad warriors. Obviously, they were brave. They were strong. Obviously, Norsemen, even today, like Swedes, Norwegians, Scandinavians are on average taller than pretty much most other people in the world. So, they're naturally bigger and stuff. But also, yeah, they were mainly traders. They wanted trade. And then, part of the reason why you could say that they shifted from raiding to conquering, which is what we see in England in 865, is that they wanted farmland. Because at this time there was consolidation of power happening in Scandinavia, and the way that inheritance worked is that land would be divided among the sons. And, well, that's not a good way at accumulating wealth if the land every generation is getting smaller and smaller, because you have to continually divide it if you're not getting new land. So what a lot of people who would become Vikings would do is that they would forego their inheritance and then go join a Viking crew, which would also then, that Viking crew would be led by a disenfranchised noble, or a noble that gave up also his claim to inheritance land, so that his sibling could inherit the land, and he would be the leader of that Viking crew, and of course then, he's of noble birth, he wants to rule some land, maybe he's like, you know what, let's go conquer, and then boom, you guys, my crew, you get land to farm. land that you wouldn't have had back in Scandinavia, or you can get more land here because you gave up your portion that you would have been owed should your parents die or whatever in Scandinavia. But hey, you give it up, you have a chance at earning some land over in England post 865. That's what perhaps seems, at least in my mind, seems to be the most logical reason behind that shift. Now, of course, none of this has to do with the video Knowledgia is making. I just wanted to say that.
Could trade with the Byzantines in the future, as opposed to further raids. Shortly after this unexpected success, the Vikings began to realize that they could actually make more money by executing milder raids, and essentially ransoming the possessions they stole back to the people they stole them from, or allowing themselves to be paid off to avoid raiding some targets, while continuing their trade elsewhere. This resulted in the Vikings obtaining the land that would soon become the Duchy of Normandy, when the Frankish...
So, what the Frankish monarchs would do to, and what England could not really do, England was not a wealthy place until really the late, at this time England was not wealthy because it was so disunified, and following the collapse of Western Rome and the Roman legion exodus from Britain, the entire economy of Britain just completely collapsed. So the kingdoms of England did not necessarily have the wealth to pay I think it would be called a weregeld, to the Vikings to get them to leave. Francia, on the other hand, definitely had that money to pay off the Vikings to get them to fuck off. But England, essentially, it would be pretty much Alfred. Wessex really was the only country that had the money to pay off the Vikings. And even the Vikings would not stay gone. They would come back after a few years. So Alfred had to search for more permanent solutions at keeping them away.
King was unable to bribe them by any other means of payment. This led to a group of Vikings staying in Normandy and beginning to assimilate with the French Christian culture.
Yep.
The rest of the Vikings, however, changed trajectory and made their way up to what is now the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland to continue their raiding and trading ways. This directed them to another exception from the overarching goal of taking no land. Whether it was their initial plan or not, between 865 and 878, the Vikings not only plundered but conquered the Saxon kingdoms of East Anglia.
I would say that it was a goal of the Vikings to conquer, specifically in 865, by the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in East Anglia. They specifically, you see it in, so the East Anglian king, I believe, also sets up a deal, and I think he also pays them off too, to get them to leave for a time. And so they go up to Northumbria. Northumbria would be the first one to fall, and in Northumbria there is like a civil war happening at the same time as this, as the time of the Great Heathen Army's arrival, and they pretty much play politics, play a Game of Thrones, and support one monarch over the other, and pretty much then that monarch has to pay like a tribute or something to the Vikings. Essentially, he's a puppet king, is what happens there. And then we see that happen in Eastern Mercia. Western Mercia would eventually fall under Wessex's jurisdiction in the 870s. But much of Mercia up until late 870s would be under Viking control. And then East Anglia would fall under the same thing. And, fall to the Vikings eventually.
Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. While these Vikings never really established a true static or centralized government over the occupied territories, they did.
Viking invasion of the British Isles occurred during the early Middle Ages from the 8th to the 11th centuries. Norsemen from Scandinavia traveled to Great Britain to settle, trade, and trade.
Did establish the Danelaw, which gave them some legal power as well as a cultural and linguistic influence throughout all three kingdoms.
Yes, so I like that. They did do the Eastern Mercia bit and Western Mercia there. So yeah, the Danelaw was the borders that pretty much Alfred dictated those borders. He was like, hey, let's have peace. You rule these lands and these lands are mine. You good? And the Vikings were like, we're good.
This feat was
That's
both
pretty
impressive and
oversimplified version.
unanticipated, but it was not a long-lived success on the part of the Vikings. In 927, the neighboring kingdom of Wessex launched an incursion into the Viking-occupied region in hopes of reclaiming the Saxon lands. They were successful in this endeavor.
But Wessex, this history is very, very long and complicated. I'm not going to knock them for it. The map is slightly wrong because it would still been the Danelaw. The map was changed because honestly, post 878, Alfred pretty much had control over Mercia. There was no longer a Mercian king. Instead, the leader of Mercia was referred to as Ealdorman, which is a significant change because it was previously he was referred to as King of Mercia, and now he was being referred to only as Ealdorman of Mercia. And when things were decided or whatever, Alfred was notably mentioned to be there with the Ealdorman of Mercia, Mercia.
And the Kingdom of England was created from the union of the 4 separate entities. From this point, the Vikings reverted back to their foundational habits, particularly targeting monasteries in Ireland across the way, and capturing some of the inhabitants to sell into the slave trade, as they had previously done with the Slavs and Western monks. When the Scandinavian pirates stumbled across Iceland next, though, they did choose to settle the island as it was an easy target with no resistance. This is about the time that the Viking Age as a whole began to change. One significant development was the increasing number of Norsemen converting to Christianity in response to missionary efforts by the Christians, and simply being exposed to the religion through their travels. Near the end of the 10th century, the number of converts drastically increased, and a notable amount of these new Christians were of the Scandinavian elite. While the sudden boom in Christianity was a change for the Viking Age, the only impact it really had on the Vikings' behavior initially was simply that some began to call their raids crusades now. At home, however, this new relationship with fellow Christian nations and the religion as a whole seemed to impact the statehood within the Scandinavian nations and began a markedly slow shift toward the countries that make up that region today. And over time, the new nobles and leadership within the area began to crack down on the Vikings' less civilized endeavors. This was the beginning of the end of the Viking Age. As the cultural and lifestyle of the Scandinavians and their pirates began to adapt to the world around it, the Viking life began to fade on its own, in an environment that no longer encouraged it to grow, and moreover, tried to prevent it from expanding further. The Vikings' influence and power dwindled over the next decades. 1066 is generally marked as the final year of the Viking Age in particular. When Harold III, King of Norway, attempted to invade and seize
I would agree with this statement of 1066 being the end of it, with the fall of Harold.
England, his troops were presently crushed by those of the Saxon king, Harold Godwinson, and Harold III himself was killed during the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This was the last significant Viking invasion of any.
Battle of Hastings, 14th of October, 1066. Was fought between the Norman-French army of William the Duke of Normandy and an English army under the Anglo-Saxon king Harold II. The Normans were descendants of the Vikings. They won this battle, starting the conquest of England. Correct.
Anywhere in Europe,
I feel like everyone
and is
knows
generally seen as the collapse of the Vikings as they had once been known. So why did this happen? Why did the Vikings collapse? Well, the answer is not as clear as one might hope. Even the Battle of Stamford Bridge was not some type of huge catalyst in the Vikings' downfall. Yes, it is usually seen as the official end of the age, but the Vikings' way of life had already been fizzling out. The introduction and mass conversion of Christianity might, of all things, be the main.
Vikings have been assimilated to other cultures over time. Raids became increasingly rare, probably because they were not so profitable, and the surrounding king. I think it's mainly influence of Christianity, and then also kingdoms becoming, making it harder for Vikings to, profit.
Factor in this
money.
Slow fade out. But even more, it was the decision of the new Scandinavian nobility to discourage and even eventually put an end to the Viking raids and incursions that really began to seal the
I like
coffin.
this
It
map
was
here.
essentially
This
a
is nice.
fairly modest chain of events that, in time, led to a
Dots.
society that no longer allowed the Vikings' most prosperous acts to continue, sequentially bringing an end to their lifestyle, culture, and any global influence or power. People would still write about the Vikings for centuries to come, and a slightly skewed view of their legacy has lived on even today.
Yep.
But nonetheless, the Viking Age came to an end almost as easily as it had begun.
This was good. It was definitely, obviously, you know, this isn't an in-depth explanation. It's, and that's not what I was looking for it to be. I'm just adding the extra words. I'm just adding the extra information because it's something that I know. So it's not a negative point on, Knowledgia's video. I think they did a great job. I think this is a great introductory video for people wanting to learn a bit about the Vikings. I mean, this is the kind of videos that got me interested in the time period that I studied. So I don't think they did anything wrong. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. Obviously, it's all information that I pretty much already knew. But yeah, they did a good job here. Obviously, the whole issue of, post 865 Vikings conquering England, it's a very it's unknown why they truly did it, because they obviously left no written sources, and written sources, also to help explain the whole lot, not much written sources by the Vikings and why didn't the Vikings do it? Why were Christians and Muslims and Orthodox peoples the ones that left behind written resources in Europe? What we see also is that after the fall of Western Rome and the Roman legions leaving Britain, we see a complete collapse of society up there. But what we also see when the Saxons and Angles and Jutes migrate over to the England, what we see is now written sources disappear again because no longer Romans or Christians are living there. It is now dominated by Germanic peoples, Germanic pagans. And then when Christianity returns really to Britain and expands through and converts the Saxons, Angles, and Jutes of England, we see writing return. We see writing start to happen again. And this is also a process we see in Germany when Charlemagne starts his conquest and then also begins to, spread Christianity throughout the pagan Germans of the time period. We see then writing become popular again. So it's not something that was unique to Scandinavia. It's something that was pretty much an aspect of pagan, somewhat tribal life, is that they would not leave behind written sources. Really, our written sources come from, Christians, Islam, Muslims, Orthodox, Greeks and stuff, and then China, India, places like that would leave behind good written sources, Japan as well. But pretty much tribal pagan people of Northern Europe did not. That was Why Did the Vikings Collapse by Knowledgia. I enjoyed this video. I hope you guys did too. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Knowledgia, if you're ever doing a video on Alfred the Great, I have a 27-page thesis. I can help. I can make it overly complicated. That's what I can do. I'm not good at simplifying things. I can make it really overcomplicated. Oh man, spent 10 pages talking about the Fjord system. Or was it 10 pages? I can't even remember what I wrote in my thesis. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.